Does JD Vance have a tactical mindset about how to encourage Europe to step up in the cause of its own defence? Or does he actually just hate and loathe Europe, full stop? It does rather matter. JD Vance is currently favoured by many in the MAGA movement as the natural successor to Donald Trump. Let's leave aside the numerous factors that could block that outcome. A topic for another video perhaps, but clearly both because of his current position and his potential future one, and bear in mind that because of Trump's age he could end up becoming president before 2029, so yes, it does rather matter. And if it turns out he does hate Europe, the question is why, and what, if anything, would Europeans do about it? There have been two inputs recently relevant to the first question. Vance spoke at the Munich Security Conference, where you would normally address the great geopolitical challenges facing the world. Vance, however, astonished his audience by not mentioning Russia and Ukraine at all, but instead lambasting European countries for what he described as failures of free speech, talking about the threat from within as being more serious than the threat from external hostile actors. I still think the most likely reason why he did that was the fact that Vance knew his boss cared a lot more about the Russia-Ukraine situation, but also that he hadn't decided what he was going to do about it yet, and Trump could literally do anything at any time. A fact that we've pretty much seen in action since then. And so Vance didn't want to undermine his credibility by talking on an area where he could easily be contradicted the very next day by his boss. However, bashing the Europeans over culture war issues and free speech, that was safe territory. That would always get the approval of MAGA generally and Trump specifically, and it just so happened that it was a subject Vance seemed to have strong feelings about anyway, and was very happy to create a stir over. Now, that's certain evidence, but it's not enough. You could look at that and argue, as some did, that he was simply delivering a message to Europe about problematic policy choices, a candid friend, delivering what needed to be heard, difficult though it may be. But then we got to see what Vance was saying about Europe in private, thanks to the Signalgate leak. In that exchange, Vance argued against a military action against the Houthis in Yemen, and he said this: 3% of US trade runs through the Suez, 40% of European trade does. There is a real risk that the public doesn't understand this or why it's necessary. I'm not sure the President is aware how inconsistent this is with his message on Europe right now. Note the thrust of this argument. He didn't suggest there was no self-interest for the US in carrying out the strike, but he argued that the fact that it would serve European interests even more was an active reason not to do it. Think about that for a moment. If you are the valued ally and partner of someone, then the fact you have an action that serves your own interest but helps them even more, wouldn't you think that would be a good thing? When it became clear the weight of opinion on the operation went the other way, Vance quickly conceded, but still complained again that he was not happy that this would benefit Europe. If you think we should do it, let's go. I just hate bailing Europe out again. Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth consoled him for losing the debate by empathising. VP, I fully share your loathing of European freeloading. It's pathetic. This is the telling exchange. This was not a man thinking about how best to motivate countries to take responsibility for their defence. It was to actively punish Europe, to advocate for not taking an action because it would benefit them. And if you had to do an action that would have that side effect, well, at the very least, make yourself feel better by insisting that they're going to pay you back for it someday, regardless of the fact that they didn't actually ask you to take the action in the first place. Are these the words and actions of a man you can believe would feel obligated to meet NATO's Article 5 commitments to defend European NATO countries if they were attacked by Russia? It's worth remembering as well that the Oval Office meltdown with Ukraine's President Zelensky featured JD Vance's hectoring demand, "Have you even said thank you?" That is not the attitude of someone that has supported an ally. It is someone who resents having helped someone against their personal preference. So the evidence right now is that Vance actually, yes, detests Europe. So then you have to ask the question, why? At Munich, he berated European countries for supposedly sharing America's values but not living up to them. But he has not criticised the alternative values of, for example, Putin's Russia, about which you would expect countries with that shared base of values to have a lot more to say about. The closest he came when directly questioned on the matter in a 2024 interview of Meet the Press, he conceded that Putin was clearly an adversary and a competitor. Think about what a neutral word that is. A competitor. He refused to label Putin as an enemy and said, just because we don't like somebody doesn't mean that we can't occasionally engage in conversations with them. So a significantly lighter touch for the country that, let me remind you, invaded another, killed and raped civilians, kidnapped children and sought to topple a government, than, say, Denmark or Germany. So I'm not persuaded about the argument that it's because European countries aren't living up to the shared values of the West as we have historically known them. There's something else. But then, of course, what we've had reason to do over the last 3 months is to realise that what used to be the values of the United States are not MAGA values. The US did not threaten to annex a neighbour before MAGA. It did not slap 20 or 25% tariffs on its allies before MAGA. It did not make every action on the world stage a commercial transaction before MAGA. It didn't totally disregard any use of soft power before MAGA, nor abandon any sense that as the most economically successful country in the world, it had at least some obligations to help someone else where they were in difficulty. And while JD Vance is preaching free speech to Europe, his MAGA administration is threatening neighbours, trying to impeach or replace judges, exceeding executive powers and sacking anyone who might try to dissuade them. Let's remember what a younger JD Vance once said about Donald J. Trump. He said this, "I go back and forth between thinking Trump is a cynical asshole like Nixon, who wouldn't be that bad and might even prove useful, or that he's America's Hitler." So from that to being the enthusiastic participant in a process that is bringing some level of autocracy to the United States. Certainly many of the things being done, as I've discussed in the previous video, are right from the autocratic playbook. It seems to me that JD Vance is on a hell of a political journey. Do we think he's wrestling with some cognitive dissonance in the steps that he's taking as he pushes himself forward to be one of the most abrasive figures on behalf of MAGA? I mean, he's a relatively smart person, so you assume he's made the calculation. I'm doing this because this is how MAGA works. If he's to succeed Donald Trump to become the next president, he has to A, not fall out with Trump in the meantime, and B, appeal to the base by feeding them red meat at every media opportunity. It's a rational calculation that, if you follow it to its logical conclusion, takes you to a pretty dark place. So let's then take as more evidence what are the things that Vance has criticised European countries for. He's been critical of Brussels over deciding to withhold funds from Hungary and the former populist regime of Poland over democracy and rule of law concerns. He said, quote, "That's not a rules-based order, that's Europe, from Brussels and Berlin, imposing liberal, imperialistic views on the rest of the continent." There has been a definite pattern to his critiques. He had no criticism to offer the old Polish regime, which introduced an autocratic system, replacing independent media, judiciary and state-owned corporations, all with loyalists. But he slammed Donald Tusk after his party had successfully been elected and deposed that regime, and he started reversing those changes. After Tusk had criticised the blocking of US aid for Ukraine, JD Vance said this: "The new leader of Poland is arresting political opponents and owes his country's security to the generosity of mine." The references to arrests of two previous lawmakers who were tried and found guilty of corruption before Tusk took office, but had been pardoned in advance by the old regime in a manner that the courts held to be invalid. He might consider showing some appreciation, or at least toning down his own authoritarian impulses. Now, this was well before he was elected and had started to introduce authoritarian moves of his own. On Germany, Vance had approved the growing popularity of the far-right AfD party, to the degree that whilst he was in Berlin, he snubbed the German Chancellor and met with AfD leaders instead. Vance said that there was no place for firewalls in European politics. In other words, the practice of mainstream parties that are committed to democracy, refusing to cooperate or collaborate with parties that are seen to be anti-democracy. Vance had no problem with anti-democratic parties like the AfD. Clearly, he now feels that since he's gone full MAGA, these are his political bedfellows. "To many of us on the other side of the Atlantic," he said, "it looks more and more like old entrenched interests hiding behind ugly Soviet-era words like misinformation and disinformation, who simply don't like the idea that somebody with an alternative viewpoint might express a different opinion or, God forbid, vote a different way, or even worse, win an election." The German Defence Minister Boris Pistorius defended his country against this charge. He said, "Every opinion has a voice in this democracy. It makes it possible for partly extremist parties like AfD to campaign completely normally, just like every other party." But he added, "Democracy doesn't mean that the loud minority is automatically right, and that democracy must be able to defend itself against the extremists who want to destroy it." This is a man speaking for the country that has spent long decades coming to terms with what disastrously went wrong in its own history. The point is that, as we knew when President Trump first expressed his desire to absorb Canada and Greenland into the United States, the MAGA administration has shifted from the old rules-based world order to the Russian-approved might makes right world order. JD Vance was explicit about this. "A lot of Americans really mistrust the so-called rules-based international order because it hasn't been good for a lot of American citizens." One could argue about the validity of that statement, but it is at least very clear about the transition that he and Trump are committed to. When he was asked about what he would like to see happen in Europe, his answer was basically populist victories. This, for me, gets to the heart of it. JD Vance criticises European countries for failing on the West's shared values, but really it is he and Trump who are seeking to transform those values. No longer promoting or defending democracy, instead embracing autocratic, anti-democratic parties. Promoting free speech only because it's a vehicle whereby the disinformation and polarisation that helps to get such parties elected can reach people. There is no such commitment to free speech in America. If it comes, say, on supporting Palestinians in Gaza, which can get you deported even if you have a green card. You can rehearse all the arguments you like about why that's okay. None of them sit well with free speech absolutism. In other words, JD Vance's journey into becoming the agent of autocracy gives him enough cognitive dissonance as it is, because his previous comments about Trump show that this isn't where he started. So he hates Europe for being the still standing bastion of the shared values he is consciously leaving behind and feeling slightly guilty about. So long as Europe falls to the same populists, he can tell himself that this is the inevitable direction of history, that it happened elsewhere because it's the right thing to happen. But so long as effective and eloquent political leaders are there to resist that direction, to argue for the old consensus, the old values, he probably sees that as a more powerful threat and rebuke to his honour from people who, after all, he despises and considers to be weak. This is why what JD Vance feels about Europe is not geopolitical strategy, it is visceral, in a way that it isn't particularly for Trump. Based on how Vance frames his identity, on how he tells himself in the morning that he's still somehow one of the good guys and he's the powerful person in the room beset by the resistance only of pygmies. All things considered, he will be the leader MAGA needs if, and only if, it is really determined to go into exactly the same dark place that the most autocratic parties of Europe would go to given the chance.